Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's indeed a privilege to be here and share, exciting trends and insights into how India shops online. Before we get into India, would love to, again, taking from what Abhish is doing, love to get the audience input. Let's start with the global landscape. Folks here, if you look at the top 10 largest global retailers, right? Top 10 across the globe, largest retailers. What share of that sale came from online first retailers? Any guesses in 23? Clue, it's a number between 0 and 100. So, other numbers, 30%, 40. I see where this is going. So, this was true exactly about 10 years back. It was about 25% to be precise, 10 years back. But what's happened is, if you actually look at it, we see that in 2023, 2/3 of that sale came from online first retailers. You should remember that you have behemoths here. Retail is not a new industry, it's been there forever. But just in 2023, 2/3 of the sales of the top 10 global retailers came from online first retailers. And what is obviously implicit is the offline behemoths have also jumped onto the online bandwagon. Suffices to say that online as a channel has been a force disruptor within the modern retail landscape itself. So this is an important kind of context that we're setting globally as well as we go into looking at how India has transformed and what are some of the trends going forward. What I'm going to do over the next few minutes, and I'll keep it short, is really talk about 5 trends that we truly feel is going to change or influence the e-retail landscape in India. The first one that you see there is around just solid foundations. As a market, a lot has been spoken about India, as the choice for any investment, as the demographic dividends and all of those. But even specifically from an e-commerce or e-retail context, you will see that there is significantly strong fundamentals in India, and we'll talk about that. So that's number one. The second one is actually the emergence of very distinct micro-consumer segments. Right? I mean, earlier we talk about this. A lot of people in this room have, I know I'm preaching to the choir when we talk about many Indias, mini Indias and all of that. But what's very interesting that we have seen over the last many years is micro segments have started emerging and now they're growing in scale and they're very material, which means that the way we address them as brands, as retailers, it has to be very different because they have distinct needs and we'll have to think about that. The third one is really a parallel to that, which is as distinct consumer segments emerge, there are some very interesting disruptive business models within e-commerce that are also coming through. The fourth is around sustainable growth, and what does that mean for brands, right? Especially in the context of advertising, in the context of seller services, and so on and so forth. And the last one, you'll be living in under a cave if you've not heard about that term. Mayur is the expert. He's going to talk extensively about that, but at least outside in looking at it, what transformational power generative AI can have in this industry. So those are the 5 themes, probably a couple of pages across each of them that we'll kind of go through today. So let me start with the first one on just the fundamentals. Now, what you see here is actually how India is a very unique retail market, structurally speaking, right? If you look at the large economies or large retail markets in the world, and we'll be amongst the top 5, what is interesting is the extent of salience that grocery has as a category and kirana has as a channel is unparalleled when you compare to any other country. So as you know, in India, about 70-75% of the retail market is still contributed by grocery. And that same number goes down to about 30-35% in China, about 25-30% or so in the US. So that's one. The second insight that you see on the right here is actually about how fragmented the demand is in India. And this, when we saw the data, it was quite eye-popping. You can imagine here, literally what we did was we looked at the number of cities, top 50 cities, how much of area do they constitute within the specific country. So you see India, US, China. And we looked at how much of the demand is concentrated in this space. And as you can see from the data, it's quite evident that in India, the demand is a lot more fragmented. There is a lot of consumption that's happening in Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 India, and so on and so forth. So structurally, it's a unique kind of retail market. And that makes it interesting because there's a lot of innovation potential and so much that you can do here. Now, what we essentially, when we look at the e-retail market, in 23, it has grown to about 57 to about $60 billion in 2023. Now, if you look at the growth of this and how it has panned out versus 22, it is about 17 to 20% growth. That's what we have seen. What this essentially means is between 2020 and 2023, there is about, in a given year, anywhere between $8 to $12 billion of GMV gets added. So that's the kind of rough math. About $8 to $12 billion annually gets added every year. And 22 to 23 was actually a slower growth at 17 to 20%, because prior to that, the historical growth has always been around 25 to 30%. And everybody here in the room is aware of that, the macro situation, the inflationary pressures, which has pinched the wallet, especially of the middle-class household, which has resulted in a little bit reduction in terms of discretionary spend. But that said, if you look at the online penetration or the online adoption, that has seen a steady growth. And as we look forward, and I'll talk about some of the factors as well, we see a healthy growth growing all the way up to $165 to $180 billion by 2028. So that's a pretty handsome 23 to 25% CAGR year on year for the entire e-commerce market, all categories put together. Now, if you look at this and double click into what is driving that, what gives us so much confidence that it's actually going to grow, we have analyzed this data across multiple markets, right? Developed markets, developing markets, in North America, South America, Southeast Asia, across the board. And what's interesting is you can summarize it into 4 trigger factors that usually drives a spike or an inflection in e-retail growth. Number 1 is really about, how do you make data more accessible? So digital access and physical access easier. So this is really about data prices coming down. It's also about logistics enabling massive reach. As we discussed, there's a massive demand fragmentation. How do you get to 99% of the PIN codes in India, 100% of the PIN codes in India? That's a big enabler. The second one is really more affordability and more convenience through logistics efficiencies, right? You lower the cost per shipment, it's much more affordable for the consumer, but you also get it faster to them, and it's much more convenient at your doorstep, which is the second factor. Third one is really about building a rich digital ecosystem so the consumer finds enough reason for them to get on and actually access and see. It could be commerce, it could be services, it could be just engagement, but that's the third factor. And the fourth one is really around affluence, right? One would assume that affluence is what actually kind of increases the discretionary spend, and that essentially drives further growth. Now, if you look at what's happened in India, the first 3 factors is actually been, either it's already played out or is playing out pretty well. But the one that's not really gotten to its potential is the last one, which is the affluence or our GDP per capita. And we know that India has been at about $2,500 or so, roundabouts, GDP per capita. Again, an interesting insight that we saw as we looked at multiple markets is that there is this magic number. Now, I'll be lying if I say it's a perfect science, but it's a fairly good rubric which holds true for multiple markets that we have seen. Around the $4,000 GDP per capita mark, we see that there has been an inflection in e-retail. So you'll see some of the charts here. Essentially what happens is the row below, you see 4.6, 3.9. Around the $4,000 GDP per capita, you see affluence starts kicking in. People spend more on discretionary spends, and you see that e-retail also sees a good fillip. We are in that journey, and we are hopeful. If you look at over the next few years how this is going to pan out, you will see that in India, earlier we had an income pyramid, right? Pretty much a triangle, which would be there, a lot more households in the lower middle income and low income. That is essentially kind of changing shape into more of a diamond and so on and so forth. But what we estimate is over the next 5 years or so, about 60 to 70 million Indian households will get elevated from the lower income and low middle income to an upper middle and upper income. Now, this is one that will actually meaningfully change the GDP per capita. And once that is done, that's the 4th trigger point which will actually give. So long story short, enough reasons, as I said, to be convinced that there's a lot of opportunity, and we are going to see that 25 to 30% growth as we go forward over the next few years. We'll move into the second theme, which is really around distinct micro-consumer segments. Let's start with what's happened from a consumer base. We spoke about $57 to $60 billion as a GMV. What we are essentially seeing here is basically there is about 240 million shoppers who have come online. And those shoppers are still a fraction of the folks who actually use internet in India. As you can see, it's only 30 to 40% of the internet users actually use or shop online. So there is a significant headroom that's available to be able to capture and reach out to more consumers. And what we see in these consumers is, as I mentioned, distinct consumer segments. First one, about 70% of the online shoppers are coming in from tier 2 plus. If you look at the population by age, about 1 in 3 are already Gen Z, and Alpha as well, but Gen Z participating a lot more in commerce. And the last 1 in 3 consumers are from lower middle income. So these are examples of 3 micro segments, as I mentioned, which are fairly meaningful, and you need models that can actually service them because their needs in terms of service levels, the selection, and all of that is quite different. So what we're essentially seeing, this is a question of new consumers coming on board, but equally interesting is what's happening to the mature shopper, the shoppers who've been online, what's happening to them. And we looked at a large consumer base here that actually came online around 2019. And we looked at over a 3-year period what has happened in terms of their growth. Roughly, again, rough numbers here, their GMV spend online has doubled. It's been a mix of more categories, better price points, different, more frequency and all of those, but roughly 2 times it's doubled. So really the path forward is as obvious as it would be, is more new customers coming online, given only 30% of the internet users are online shoppers, but equally this story of the mature shoppers panning out, which is going to come through. Now to do all of this, as I mentioned, there are multiple business models that are emerging to cater to the various micro segments that we spoke about. 4 that I'll call out specifically are around quick commerce. Again, this group here will be very much privy to quick commerce and potentially, big users of quick commerce. But this, unlike many other places around the world, where a lot of capital was raised, but not too many players globally have been successful in scaling it, India and maybe even the Middle East is seeing a lot of these interesting players who are getting closer to the right economics to make quick commerce work. It's still a top 10 city, top 15 city phenomenon, but we would expect that this is something that's going to scale going forward as well. So that's one. Second is hyper value commerce. We spoke about 1 in 3 are from low income, low middle income. It's true in India, it's also true globally. I mean, Temu, Shein, there's enough and more examples. Temu in the last year, there were 200 million downloads of that app in 1 year. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of that, which is second trend. Third one is really around live commerce or inspiration-led. You're watching something, you're engaging with that content, how do you actually buy? This is actually scaled in Southeast Asia and China. Jury is out, how is it going to scale? It's very nascent in India. But this, we believe, is also an interesting trend going forward that we should be looking at. Last one on fast fashion. Again, almost Gen Z and fast fashion are spoken together very often. An interesting statistic is that today, across the globe, 1 in $10 spent on women's apparel is on fast fashion. There's a lot of talk. Already, I repeat that, 10% of the spend on fashion apparel is on fast fashion. For women's apparel, I beg your pardon, is on fast fashion. So these are, again, 4 big trends that we feel are going to be meaningful. In the interest of time, we spoke about quick commerce and, otherwise. I'm going to go into the 4th pillar, which is around marketing and seller services. Again, what's interesting here is what you see on this chart are 2 examples, right? The one on the right is actually advertising. When does an e-retailer offer advertising options for brands? And the left-hand side is, other services like supply chain services that you offer. What you can see here is the ones that were founded much earlier took much longer to launch these services. But you see some of the newer players in the market, actually, relatively speaking, including Flipkart, were much faster to offer some of these services. All said and done, even in ads, we have seen a massive growth. The last 3 years, there is a 4 times increase in the ad spend on e-retail channels, 4x, right? But interestingly, if you compare the data again, we are still about total digital marketing, 15 to 20% is happening on e-retail. And that number, if you compare to some of the other markets, is closer to 25, 35% or so, and much higher in China, of course. But how is this going to pan out? And what this can provide is an opportunity, because it's a very deterministic channel for brands to be able to advertise to these players, and this is going to see going forward as well. The last slide that I have is on generative AI. Again, Maya will go into a lot more detail, but just outside in, across the value chain, we see 5 big use cases for generative AI that's going to impact all of us in this room significantly. First is really around enhanced discovery, right? Versus the search and the merch, the way that today consumers interact with online retail. How do you make that much closer to the offline seamless experience that we have? A more conversational type of commerce where you can discover products much easier, and how would you go about it? So that's one where, and it come in different forms, but that's one big use case. Second is actually brand seller enablement and how that can be a lot more seamless versus what it is today. And it's even things like customer feedback synthesis, able to know whether your new product that's been launched, how well is it doing, what are the customer reviews, being able to loop that back and do that effectively. That's a second big one. Third, of course, is a lot spoken about, which is much hyper-personalized marketing and targeted, customized marketing for the consumers, which this can enable significantly. The fourth is around very seamless customer support. So similar to the seller side, for customers, how do you go and offer the best of service, and with chatbots and all of that we've been seeing. And the last one is around efficiency. Rajneesh mentioned this about the small seller and cataloging. And Maya would know the numbers better, but at least when we looked at it, the cost of doing a photo shoot, anyone, I'm sure a lot of you have actually looked at that. It comes down to 20 paise now for a catalog to be done, thanks to generative AI. That's the impact to which you can get efficiency improvements along with the others. With that, I will close, but in summary, India is well poised for a very, very powerful growth going forward. As we said, $165, $180 billion that we are expecting by 2028. If you look at it, there are lots of interesting trends in India because India is also a unique market structurally that we are going to see micro-consumer segments, different business models actually catering to them, which is going to be exciting. And as we said, there are multiple business models and multiple trends that we see, which is going to make the next 4 or 5 years very exciting. And the people in this room are going to play a key part in actually shaping that. Thank you so much.